Hello everyone, I'm Xuan. Welcome to this episode of Folk Tales. In the last video, I made quite a few pronunciation and wording mistakes due to my own oversight. I originally wanted to explain, but a mistake is a mistake. Here, I sincerely apologize to everyone and I'm truly sorry. I will be more careful in the future to avoid similar issues. Alright, I won't take up any more of your time. Let's get started with today's story. Our first story today comes from a contributor named Zhuan doesn't like washing her hair. In this story, we'll refer to her as Xiao Zhuan. Xiao Zhuan works in the Li Wan industry, which refers to the traditional Chinese opera scene. In Chinese opera, there are many different types of roles, such as Dan, Qingyi, Huadan, and Damadan. Our protagonist today is a Dan role, specifically a Huadan, which is a lively young female character. If you're interested in learning more about these opera roles and what they represent, feel free to look up related videos for more details. I won't go into all the specifics here. Xiao Zhuan began learning opera from her master at a very young age. As a child, she would occasionally go out and perform, but since she was still in school, it wasn't very frequent. Later on, when she reached a certain age, her master asked her to make a choice about her future. At 16, Xiao Zhuan dropped out of school and officially joined the troupe. At the time, the troupe traveled from place to place, performing mostly at temple fairs, events held on certain religious occasions where operas were staged in local marketplaces. They did perform in theaters from time to time, but that was rare, and usually only through her master's connections. Even then, the venues weren't particularly formal. Those early years were exhausting, but everyone in the troupe had grown up together, not the older generation, but the fellow apprentices, who were like brothers and sisters. When Xiao Zhuan was 19, her master began to feel that this constantly wandering lifestyle wasn't ideal. The older members didn't mind, they were used to it, but for the younger generation, it seemed a bit unfair. So someone suggested, why don't we set up our own place to perform? About a year later, when Xiao Zhuan was 20, they finally established their own small opera venue. It was also during that year that Xiao Zhuan came to understand herself more clearly. What had once felt uncertain became certain. She realized that she was attracted to women. In the first year after the opera garden opened, business was slow. The income was just enough to cover rent and utilities, and there was barely any money left to pay the performers, including Xiao Zhuan. However, as word spread and the opera garden's reputation grew, things gradually started to improve. Xiao Zhuan's troupe used to get a fair number of performance invitations, but they always performed the same few traditional operas. Repeating the same shows over and over wasn't sustainable. Even the most loyal fans would eventually get bored. It's like eating king crab for every meal. After a month, even that would get old. The leader of the opera garden suggested bringing in new actors from outside to offer the audience something fresh. Everyone agreed, since their own salaries wouldn't be affected, and being in their 20s, they sometimes wanted a break, too. Within a week, new performers joined the troupe. Among them was someone we'll call Luzi in this story, a man in his late 30s who played the Laosheng, the older male role in opera. With stage makeup, he looked decent, but without it, after removing his wig, fake beard, and costume, he was about 1.6 meters tall. Balding had a bulbous nose, a big mole above his upper lip with a single hair growing out of it, and teeth scattered like stars in the sky, completely out of order. From the day Luzi joined, he kept glancing at Xiao Zhuan while changing backstage. As they got to know each other, he would sometimes invite her out to eat or buy her gifts for holidays. But the Xiao Zhuan always turned him down. She was straightforward with Luzi, telling him she didn't like men, and even if she did, she wouldn't choose someone like him. Xiao Zhuan's master also noticed Luzi's interest and advised her to be careful. Not only because of the significant age difference, but also because, in the master's eyes, the two simply weren't a good match. One day, Luzi had been drinking somewhere and, emboldened by alcohol, confessed his feelings to Xiao Zhuan at the opera garden. His behavior crossed the line. He tried to hug and kiss her by force. At that moment, all the other actors were still around. When they saw Luzi harassing Xiao Zhuan, her fellow troupe members immediately intervened, stopped him, and even gave him a beating before throwing him out. From that day on, Luzi disappeared. He left all his belongings at the opera garden and didn't come back to collect them until 3 or 4 months later. But the day after Luzi was thrown out, something strange happened to Xiao Zhuan. While performing on stage, she somehow fell off and broke her arm when she instinctively tried to catch herself. She was rushed to the hospital and had surgery that same day. The doctors advised her to stay for observation for a couple of days. The next morning, Xiao Zhuan suddenly had a strange urge to see Luzi. Coincidentally, Luzi showed up at her hospital room door, carrying gifts and smiling. Normally, Xiaojuan would have been cold to him, but this time, for reasons she couldn't explain, she actually felt happy to see him. They talked for a long time, only parting when her master arrived. When Lucy left, Xiaojuan even felt a bit reluctant to see him go. During her hospital stay, Lucy visited Xiaojuan every day. She wasn't usually talkative, but somehow she found herself chatting effortlessly with Lucy, enjoying his sense of humor. After being discharged and returning home, Xiaojuan reflected on the situation, but still couldn't shake her desire to see him. While she was recovering, Lucy didn't visit her home, perhaps out of concern for his age and appearance, but he called every day, and their conversations would last late into the night. Xiaojuan knew something about this, felt off, but everything had happened so quickly that she didn't have time to process it all. Once her arm healed, Xiaojuan returned to work. Lucy began showing up every day after work to take her out for dinner and to walk her home. Xiaojuan thought, he may not be handsome, but he treats me well and seems to genuinely care for me. Before long, they became a couple. Word soon reached her master, who summoned Xiaojuan for a talk. Her master scolded her, warning that Lucy was not a good person and urging her to think carefully. But Xiaojuan was completely smitten and defended Lucy, nearly getting into a fight with her master. When her master realized words weren't working, he told Xiaojuan's parents. Her family was also strongly opposed, and one time, her brother even caught Lucy and beat him up. It seemed like the whole world was against their relationship, but Xiaojuan stubbornly insisted on being with Lucy. After falling out with her family, Xiaojuan moved in with Lucy. At first, Lucy made grand promises. He said he would treat Xiaojuan well for life, make something of himself, and prove everyone who doubted them wrong. But less than 2 months into living together, Xiaojuan discovered Lucy's fondness for drinking and hiring escorts. At first, she had no proof, so she decided to follow him one night and caught him in the act. Shockingly, Lucy hit Xiaojuan right in front of the escort. Xiaojuan was furious after being hit by Lucy in front of the escort. She packed her things and moved back to the Opera Garden's dormitory. The next day, Lucy came to the garden to apologize and begged her to return. Everyone there warned Xiaojuan not to go back with him, but she was still under his spell. A few sweet words from Lucy were enough to persuade her to leave with him again. At first, Xiaojuan hoped Lucy would change for the better, but things only got worse. He stopped working, spent his days drinking and gambling on slot machines at the arcade. With little savings to begin with, he burned through all his money in less than a month. When he ran out, he started asking Xiaojuan for money. If she refused, he beat her. From then on, Xiaojuan was constantly covered in bruises. Her friends at the Opera Garden tried to convince her to leave Lucy, but no matter how many times they pleaded, she refused. Lucy's lack of shame became even more apparent. If Xiaojuan did anything he didn't like, he would hit her on the spot, regardless of where they were. Xiaojuan later said that Lucy had even beaten her at the mall, yet she remained devoted, believing no one would ever treat her as well as Lucy. One day, Lucy's friends invited him out to eat, and Xiaojuan went along. Lucy drank so much that he vomited several times, unable to drink anymore. He insisted that Xiaojuan drink with his friends. The friends felt awkward and tried to refuse, but Lucy wouldn't have it. Xiaojuan obediently raised her glass, and the friends told her just to take a sip for politeness. She did as told, but Lucy became angry. He picked up a bottle and struck Xiaojuan on the back of the head. A man might have withstood the blow, but Xiaojuan, being a woman, passed out immediately. When she woke up, her master explained what had happened. Lucy had continued to hit her with the beer bottle after she lost consciousness, accusing her of faking it. When he realized she was unresponsive, he panicked and tried to flee. Minor injuries had become commonplace, and since no one could persuade Xiaojuan to leave Lucy, her fellow performers had given up. But her master refused to abandon her. Upon hearing what had happened, he rushed to the hospital with her fellow disciples. When they arrived, Xiaojuan was still unconscious, her face swollen and covered in bruises. No one called the police. Lucy was sitting outside the hospital room, still drunk. In truth, her master had long known about the abuse, but he kept it from her family, not wanting to worry them, especially after Xiaojuan had fallen out with them. But this time, there was no hiding it. He called Xiaojuan's family to tell them everything. Afterward, he instructed the other disciples to teach Lucy a lesson. On his command, they dragged Lucy into the hospital room and beat him soundly, with some covering his mouth and others blocking the doorway. Her master stood guard outside, while even Lucy's friends, perhaps disgusted with his behavior, helped bring him in. The beating was thorough. When Xiaojuan's family arrived, they took their turn as well. By the time Lucy left the hospital, he had to support himself on the wall, barely able to walk. Xiaojuan said that when she woke up in the hospital, the very first thing she did was look for the mule. Her family had had enough of her obsession. They took away her phone. After another 2 days in the hospital, she was sent home to convalesce. Once back home, she kept trying to get in touch with the mule, but by then he'd vanished without a trace. Day after day, she lost all appetite and interest in life. Several times, while her folks weren't watching, she bolted out the door. Luckily, they were always quick to catch her, to keep her from running off again. They assigned someone to watch her around the clock. Seeing how trapped she was, Xiaojuan grew desperate. "If I can't see him," she'd say, "what's the point of living? Might as well just die. At least then, I'd be with him." But whenever she toyed with that thought, she was either locked up or under constant guard. She never managed to slip away. By now, her family was at their wits' end. They figured she must be fixated on something, probably the mule. And that if they kept her cooped up a bit longer, she'd snap out of it. A month passed in the blur. Physically, Xiaojuan had fully recovered, yet she remained in that same dazed, vacant state. Every morning she'd sit by her bed, staring straight ahead with an unblinking gaze. One day, her master called her family to check on her. They filled him in on what had been going on lately. After hearing their account, he shook his head. "This won't do," he said. "We ought to bring in a Taoist priest to take a look. Letting things drag on like this is no good." Still, Xiaojuan's relatives insisted it was simply because she'd spent too much time with the mule. When she stopped thinking about him, she'd come to her senses. Her master began to ponder the situation. Something about it didn't feel right, far from being as straightforward as it seemed. And knowing Xiaojuan was gay, he suspected there might be more to it than met the eye. Determined to get to the bottom of it, he set some trusted contacts to dotting around for any news about the mule. Remember, we mentioned earlier that the mule was also an opera performer. His master tracked down the person who'd originally introduced them, but that fellow hadn't seen the mule in ages and couldn't even reach him by phone. Despite scouring every corner, no one could shed any light on where the mule had gone. That evening, a few men showed up at the theater. A handful of the very friends Xiaojuan had dined with the mule that fateful night. They sought out her master and told him that after Xiaojuan left the hospital, the mule had called them, begging them to help him move. The guys had refused flat out. Having a friend like that would be embarrassing enough. One of them snapped, let alone helping him. They made it clear they wanted nothing more to do with him. But the mule pleaded with them, claiming he'd been beaten so badly he couldn't even lift a finger. He begged them to do him one last favor. Out of all times, if he didn't get out of town fast, he'd only end up taking more beatings. The men hung up on him. Back at the table, they mulled over what had happened. "After all these years," one of them muttered, "who would have thought he'd turn into such a mess? We used to have such good times together." After a brief debate, they decided to give him one more chance. They arranged to meet up and assist him with packing. Though it wasn't really a full-blown move, the mule had already hired a delivery service to ship everything away. Later that night, they planned a parting dinner. Over drinks, the mule confessed that he was finished in the city's Pier Orchard, the opera world. He was heading somewhere. No one knew him. As the gathering wound down, one of the men finally asked the mule, "How could a beauty like Xiaojuan ever set her sights on a scrawny little runt like you?" They hadn't expected Luozi to brag about it, but he did. Remember, Luozi disappeared for 3 months. During that time, someone invited him to perform in Myanmar. Back then, Myanmar wasn't yet infamous for its dangerous organ trafficking. While he wasn't performing, Luozi would explore the area with local guides. He noticed that many locals followed spiritual masters, so he got curious and started asking questions. He learned that these masters could supposedly help people become wealthy or cast what's called a tame head curse, a type of Southeast Asian black magic. Depending on the region and lineage, the specifics vary, but the general idea is that a tame head can use things like human bones, blood, hair, fingernails, or even fetuses as ritual items. There are 2 main uses. One is to resolve conflicts or strengthen relationships, and the other is to cause harm or even death without the victim knowing it. Each master has their own specialty. Depending on their training, while in Myanmar, Luozi tried asking for all kinds of blessings: wealth, career, health. When he heard that a master could cast a love curse that would make someone unconditionally devoted to him, he was intrigued but skeptical. Still, since he was already asking for everything else, he figured he'd try this too. The only information he had about Xiaojuan was her name, but the master said that was enough, no need for a full birth date. As is common in many Eastern rituals, the master produced a small piece of paper covered in strange patterns and gold leaf. He explained that all Luozi had to do was hide it among Xiaojuan's personal items, and it would only work on the first person who touched it. The master warned him to keep the paper safe, even if it was damaged. Its power would remain, but if a skilled practitioner destroyed it, the curse would backfire on Luozi. After placing it, Luozi was supposed to contact the master to activate it. Luozi didn't really believe it would work, and in fact, none of the other blessings did except the tame head. After returning to China, while retrieving his belongings from the opera garden, Luozi slipped the paper into the lining of Xiaojuan's hair ornament and notified the master. The master told him to watch Xiaojuan's behavior over the next few days. All the strange things that happened after that, as previously described, unfolded then. Luozi later tried to retrieve the paper, but every time he was at the opera garden, people watched him like a hawk. Eventually, drinking heavily, he forgot all about it. When Luozi's drinking buddies realized how shameless he was, they dragged him to a public toilet and beat him up again, this time leaving him covered in filth and unable to get up. The friends who learned about what Luozi had done wanted to go straight to the opera garden and report it the next day. But they were sailors, and their captain called to say their ship was leaving earlier than expected. In the rush, they forgot all about it, and with no signal at sea, months passed before they could finally share the story. When Xiaojuan's master heard about it, he searched for the paper and eventually found it hidden in the lining of Xiaojuan's hair ornament. He immediately contacted Xiaojuan's family, but nobody knew what to do. Fortunately, her master had spent years in the opera world and knew some powerful people. He consulted many experts, but none had ever dealt with this kind of Southeast Asian curse and said their own masters hadn't taught them how to break it. Finally, he found a master who had performed the consecration of their opera garden statues of the opera patron deity and Guan Yu. In many traditional Chinese professions, people invite such deities for protection and prosperity, and these statues are consecrated through special rituals to receive divine power. Back to the story, the expert examined the paper and said the greasy substance was likely corpse oil. He explained that these Southeast Asian cult objects are complicated and dangerous. Normally, burning the paper would be enough, but he felt it might not be so simple in this case. Though he couldn't break the curse directly, he suggested a ritual after the next opera show. They should stage a Guan Yu play, then place the paper on the ground and strike it with a sword held by the garden's Guan Yu statue, before burning it in front of the patron deity's altar. Xiaojuan's master followed these instructions. That night, after the ritual was complete, the master didn't burn the paper immediately, but placed it atop an oil lamp in front of the patron deity's censer. By 10 a.m. the next morning, the paper suddenly burst into flames and was reduced to ash in seconds. That same morning, Xiaojuan, still sitting dazed by her bed, suddenly felt her mind clear. After breakfast, she sat and reflected on recent events, unable to understand why she'd been so obsessed with Luozi. Later, when her master visited and explained everything, Xiaojuan finally learned she'd been cursed. In any case, the ordeal was over. But Luozi wasn't so lucky. Word was that he went drinking at a barbecue store in another city. When a fight broke out, someone knocked over the grill, which landed on Luozi, spilling hot coals all over him. The burning grill stayed on him for a while. The store owner, seeing the injuries, fled the scene, and since it was a mobile store, nobody ever found him. Luozi spent all his savings treating his burns, and when he ran out of money, nobody would lend him more. He suffered severe burns across his upper body and face, leaving him permanently scarred, and the opera world cut all ties with him. Stories like this, where those who harm others are eventually punished, are countless. But human nature is always tempted by greed. I believe everyone watching is a kind soul, and I hope you all keep that innocence in your hearts. The next story comes from a user named Omnivore. We'll call him Xiao Di in this story. Xiao Di is quite young, and his main hobby has always been fishing. Honestly, fishing is a pretty relaxing pastime. During 2021 and 2022, when China was under strict lockdowns due to the COVID-19 pandemic, everyone was stuck at home, bored out of their minds. Xiao Di started playing with his phone and stumbled across lure fishing, a technique that quickly became an obsession. As soon as the lockdowns lifted, he went out almost every day to fish, wandering around with his rod. One night, Xiao Di and a friend went night fishing along their city's moat. There aren't many fish in urban waters, but it was more about the experience. The only friend who could join was a delivery guy they all called Courier Bro. Xiao Di said that, based on the weather and conditions, they should have caught some fish. But from 5 p.m. all the way past 11 p.m., after hours of casting, they didn't catch a single one. Frustrated, they agreed. If nothing bit by midnight, they'd give up and try again in the morning. Just after making that pact, Courier Bro suddenly jerked his rod as if he'd hooked something. Xiao Di was thrilled and asked what happened. Courier Bro said his rod felt a bit short and his hands were going numb, but he thought he'd missed the fish. This got both of them fired up, and they started casting into the river with renewed energy. At first, excitement masked any discomfort, but soon both realized their hands felt tingly. Xiaodi asked Courier Bro if he felt it too. He did, realizing their rods were made of conductive material, and that something in the river must be leaking electricity. They quickly reeled in, not daring to fish any longer. With the tingling in their hands explained, the two finally realized why they hadn't seen a single fish all night. It was the electricity leaking into the water. When the water is electrified, the fish are bound to flee. There was no point in staying, so they decided to pack up and go home. They brought headlamps, but didn't use them while fishing since many fish are sensitive to light and will hide if startled. Now, as they squatted down to pack up, they turned the lights on. Suddenly, they heard a sound coming from the water not far away. Almost simultaneously, both turned to look and saw an inflatable kayak on the river. On it sat a person, left hand gripping a rod, right hand holding a metal strainer. The sight made everything clear. All the missing fish and the electric shock they'd run into a so-called electric fisherman, nicknamed Tesla Infantry in Chinese fishing circles, notorious for using electricity to stun fishes. Thankfully, Xiaodi and Courier Bro had packed up early. If they stayed, they might have been shocked by the electric fisherman too. In the fishing community, there's a pecking order, but everyone looks down on electric fishermen. In the darkness, it was hard to see each other's faces. Xiaodi and Courier Bro started picking up rocks and hurling them at the kayak. A few seemed to hit, and the Tesla Infantry started paddling toward them, but had nothing to defend himself with. As the kayak neared the shore, Xiaodi and Courier Bro saw it suddenly sink below the surface. Normally, a kayak will take some time to go under, even if it flips. But this one disappeared in just a few seconds, as if pulled straight down. Xiaodi and Courier Bro were stunned by what they just witnessed, but their first instinct was to jump in and try to save the man. Luckily, they always brought automatic inflatable life vests and a fish stringer. Courier Bro's was a DIY version made from climbing rope and was over 10 meters long. Since Courier Bro couldn't swim, Xiaodi went into the water himself, not even bothering to remove his clothes. The spot where the kayak sank was close to shore and only about 1.5 meters deep, enough that the water reached the man's neck. Xiaodi managed to pull the Tesla Infantry out, and as soon as he did, the kayak mysteriously floated back to the surface. Together, they dragged it to shore and found it completely undamaged. The Tesla Infantry only had a minor head injury, likely from being hit by a rock. Once on land, he sat shivering, even though the weather wasn't cold. Xiaodi and Courier Bro scolded him for using electricity to fish, saying he brought misfortune on himself. Whatever he'd experienced, it must have shaken him badly. He suddenly dropped to his knees, kowtowing and begging for forgiveness, promising never to use electricity for fishing again. Seeing this, Xiaodi and Courier Bro quickly helped him up, saying it wasn't necessary, and that as long as he changed his ways, they wouldn't do anything to him. The man insisted on treating them to a meal to thank them for saving his life. They tried to refuse, but he immediately dropped to his knees again. Realizing they had no choice, they agreed. After changing into clean clothes, the three of them found a 24-hour restaurant. The Tesla Infantry even bought each of them 2 packs of cigarettes as a thank you gift. While they were eating, the three started talking about what had happened that night. Xiaodi and Courier Bro were still confused about how the kayak had vanished so suddenly, so they asked the Tesla Infantry what happened. He explained that, after being hit by a rock, he got angry and was about to come ashore with his new energy lure rod to confront them. But just as he neared the bank, the kayak suddenly sank. He could swim, but as he went under, he felt a pair of hands grab his neck and push him down to the riverbed. He said that where his neck touched the water's surface, he felt those hands, and no matter how much he struggled, he couldn't break free. The hands were slippery, like the mucus on a fish, and the water was so dark, he couldn't see what was holding him. Afterwards, Xiaodi noticed a red mark around the Tesla Infantry's neck that looked like a handprint. The man said that, as he tried to free himself, he noticed a head floating on the surface, staring right at him. That's why, when he got back on shore, he knelt and kowtowed, not to Xiaodi and Courier Bro, but toward the river, begging for mercy. He said the floating head spoke to him, warning that this time he was lucky, but if he ever used electricity to fish again, he'd never leave the river alive. After finishing its warning, the head drifted away and vanished. Xiaodi and Courier Bro got goosebumps hearing this, especially since they hadn't seen or heard anything themselves. After dinner, the three added each other on WeChat and went their separate ways. About a month later, the Tesla Infantry told them he'd shared the story with his family, who worried he'd been cursed. They went to a local temple, and the abbot said what he'd encountered was no ordinary ghost, but likely the river's guardian spirit. He was told that If he was still afraid, he should release some fish into the river as an offering for peace of mind and good karma. The Tesla infantry bought a batch of fish fry online and released them into the river. Later, when Xiaodi and Courier Bro went fishing again, they found a small stone tablet in the grass inscribed with River God of XXX, with ashes from burned incense nearby. Remembering what had happened before, they didn't dare take pictures and quickly left. So, a word of advice to everyone: if you have a dangerous hobby, it's best to let it go. No matter how skilled you are, if you spend enough time by the river, you'll eventually get into trouble. Especially with electric fishing, even one mistake can lead to a lifetime of regret. Alright, that's it for today's story. Wishing you all happiness and success. See you next time.